Sarah Matthews rushed through Atlanta International Airport's busy terminal, pulling her expensive leather suitcase behind her. The clicking of her high heels echoed against the floor as she checked her watch for the fifth time in 10 minutes. Her flight to Chicago was scheduled to depart in 45 minutes, and she couldn't afford any delays. As a senior marketing executive, she had an important client meeting the next morning. Reaching gate B7, Sarah noticed something was different about the usual pre-boarding atmosphere. Several passengers were gathered near the large windows, pointing and smiling as they watched the flight crew doing their pre-flight checks around the aircraft. Sarah didn't understand what the fuss was about until she heard a young boy excitedly tell his mother, "Look, Mom, that pilot just landed the plane like in those cool videos we watched." Sarah's eyes followed their gaze to see a tall, well-built black man in his 30s, wearing a crisp pilot's uniform with 4 stripes on his shoulders. He carried himself with quiet confidence as he walked around the aircraft, carefully checking various parts of the plane. This was Captain James Richardson, though Sarah didn't know his name yet. The gate area was starting to fill up with more passengers. An elderly couple sat nearby, the husband reading a newspaper while his wife knitted something that looked like a scarf. A group of college students huddled around their phones, probably sharing memes or social media posts. 2 businessmen in suits discussed their upcoming meetings, and a young mother tried to keep her toddler entertained with a coloring book. Sarah's perfectly maintained smile suddenly dropped from her face. She watched as Captain Richardson entered the terminal and approached the gate desk, speaking quietly with Maria Rodriguez, the gate agent. Something about this scene bothered Sarah deeply, though she wouldn't admit to herself what it was. She gripped her designer handbag tighter and marched toward the desk. "Excuse me," Sarah interrupted their conversation, her voice carrying that particular tone of someone who was used to getting their way. "Is he going to be our pilot today?" She pointed at Captain Richardson, who had just walked away to continue his preparations. Maria looked up from her computer screen, her professional smile firmly in place. "Yes, ma'am. Captain Richardson will be your pilot today. We'll begin boarding in about 20 minutes. Sarah's perfectly plucked eyebrows furrowed together. "Are you sure that's appropriate? I mean, has he been properly vetted? I have a very important meeting tomorrow, and I need to make sure we're in capable hands." Maria's smile didn't waver, but her eyes hardened slightly. She'd been working at the airline long enough to recognize what Sarah was really saying. "I can assure you, ma'am, that Captain Richardson is one of our most experienced pilots. He has an excellent safety record and has been with our airline for over a decade." Other passengers nearby began to take notice of the conversation. A few pulled out their phones, sensing that something newsworthy might be unfolding. The elderly man with the newspaper lowered it slightly, peering over his reading glasses at the scene. "I'd like to speak to a supervisor," Sarah demanded, her voice getting louder. "I have concerns about safety, and I think other passengers would agree with me." She looked around, seeking support, but found only uncomfortable or disapproving faces. The young boy who had been excited about the pilot earlier tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, why is that lady angry about our pilot? He looks cool." His mother shushed him quietly, but not before Sarah shot them an irritated look. The tension in the gate area was growing thicker by the minute. Some passengers began whispering among themselves, while others pretended to be absorbed in their phones or books. Captain Richardson, who had returned to check something with Maria, overheard the entire exchange. Instead of reacting, he maintained his professional demeanor, checking his flight papers with the same calm focus he always showed. His lack of response to Sarah's obvious prejudice spoke volumes about his character. Maria picked up the gate phone, her movements deliberately slow and professional. "I'll call a supervisor for you, ma'am. Please have a seat, and they'll be here shortly to address your concerns." Sarah stood her ground, clutching her handbag like a shield. She didn't notice how many passengers were now watching her, their faces showing a mix of disgust, curiosity, and disappointment. The scene was set for what would become a viral moment in the making, though none of them knew it yet. The airport supervisor, Mr. Thompson, arrived at gate B7 within 5 minutes. He was a tall man in his 50s with gray hair and kind eyes, wearing a navy blue suit with the airline's logo. Sarah Matthews immediately turned to face him, ready to share her concerns about Captain Richardson. "Ma'am, what seems to be the problem?" Mr. Thompson asked calmly, though he had already been briefed about the situation through his radio. Sarah lowered her voice, not enough to prevent nearby passengers from hearing. "I'm worried about the qualifications of that pilot," she said, pointing towards Captain Richardson, who was now checking something on his tablet near the gate counter. "Are you sure he's experienced enough? I mean, how did he get this position?" Mr. Thompson's face remained professional, but his eyes showed clear disapproval. Captain Richardson graduated top of his class from the Air Force Academy. He served our country for 8 years as a fighter pilot before joining our airline. He has over 15,000 flight hours and has been with us for 12 years. Several passengers nearby started clapping. A young woman in business attire stood up from her seat. "I've flown with Captain Richardson before," she announced loudly. "He got us through terrible weather in Denver last month. Best landing I've ever experienced." Sarah's face turned red, but she wasn't ready to give up. "Well, I still don't feel comfortable. Can't you assign a different pilot? I'm a frequent flyer with your airline, and I demand better service." A middle-aged man in a wheelchair spoke up next. "Better than what?" "Better than a highly qualified pilot with an amazing safety record. Ma'am, the only problem here is your prejudice." The gate area had become very quiet. Even people wearing headphones had taken them off to watch what was happening. Some passengers were recording the scene on their phones, while others shook their heads in disappointment at Sarah's behavior. Captain Richardson chose this moment to approach the group. His walk was confident, his uniform perfectly pressed, and his voice steady and professional. "Mr. Thompson, we're ready to begin boarding. Weather reports show clear skies all the way to Chicago." Sarah took a step back, as if trying to distance herself from him. Captain Richardson turned to her with a polite smile. "Ma'am, I understand you have concerns about today's flight. I want to assure you that your safety is my top priority. I've been flying this route for many years, and I'm happy to answer any specific questions about my qualifications or experience." His calm response made Sarah look even more uncomfortable. Some passengers started taking pictures, knowing this would make an interesting social media post. A teenage girl whispered to her father, "Dad, she's being racist, right?" Her father nodded sadly. Mr. Thompson stepped forward again. "Ms. Matthews, you have 2 options. You can either board the flight under Captain Richardson's very capable command, or we can help you book a different flight. But I should warn you that Captain Richardson also trains many of our other pilots, so you might find him in the cockpit of your next flight too." Several passengers chuckled at this comment. Maria, the gate agent, had already started the boarding process for first-class passengers, and people were lining up, many giving Sarah disapproving looks as they passed by. Sarah stood there, clutching her expensive handbag, looking around for support but finding none. A small crowd had gathered, and most people were either recording the scene or watching with obvious disapproval. Even a few airport staff members had stopped to observe the situation. Finally, Sarah's shoulders dropped in defeat. "Fine," she muttered. "I'll take the flight." She joined the boarding line, trying to avoid eye contact with anyone. As passengers walked past Captain Richardson to board, many stopped to shake his hand or pat him on the back. "We trust you, Captain," an elderly lady said loudly enough for Sarah to hear. "Thank you for your service, both in the Air Force and here." Captain Richardson thanked everyone professionally, maintaining his dignity throughout the entire situation. He stood tall at the gate, checking boarding passes and greeting each passenger with the same warm smile. Even Sarah, who kept her eyes fixed on the floor as she hurried past him onto the jet bridge. The boarding process continued as passengers made their way onto the plane. Sarah Matthews found her seat in business class, 2C, an aisle seat she had specifically chosen for her comfort. Her hands were still shaking slightly as she stored her expensive handbag under the seat in front of her. A young black woman in a crisp business suit sat down next to Sarah in seat 2B. She gave Sarah a long, knowing look before pulling out her laptop. Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat, the events at the gate still fresh in her mind. She could hear other passengers talking about her as they walked past to reach their seats in economy class. "That's her," someone whispered. "The one who complained about Captain Richardson." "Can you believe some people still think like that in this day and age?" Another passenger responded. The flight attendant, Lisa Chen, began her usual pre-flight checks in the business class cabin. When she reached Sarah's row, her professional smile remained, but there was a noticeable coolness in her voice. "Ms. Matthews, would you like a pre-flight beverage?" Before Sarah could answer, the plane's speakers crackled to life. Captain Richardson's calm, confident voice filled the cabin. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain, James Richardson, speaking. Welcome aboard Flight 2742 to Chicago O'Hare. Our flight time today will be approximately 2 hours and 15 minutes. The weather is clear, and we're expecting a smooth flight." Several passengers applauded after his announcement, something that rarely happened during standard flight announcements. Sarah sank lower in her seat, feeling the disapproving glances from those around her. The woman next to Sarah suddenly spoke up. "You know, I'm a surgeon at Chicago Memorial," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I wonder how many patients would refuse my care if they had your mindset about professional qualifications." She didn't wait for Sarah's response before returning to her laptop work. As the safety demonstration began, Sarah noticed something on her phone. The incident at the gate had already made its way onto social media. Someone had posted a video titled, "Racist Passenger Questions Black Pilot's Qualifications, Get Schooled by Airport Staff." The video was gaining views rapidly. Sarah's hands trembled as she put her phone in airplane mode. She could feel anxiety building in her chest. What would her clients think if they saw this? What about her company? She had always thought of herself as a successful businesswoman, but now she was going viral for all the wrong reasons. The plane began to taxi, and Captain Richardson's voice came over the speakers again. "Flight attendants, please prepare for takeoff." His voice was steady and professional, showing no sign of the confrontation that had occurred earlier. A young girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, walked past Sarah's seat to use the business class bathroom. She stopped and looked at Sarah with innocent curiosity. "My daddy says you were mean to the pilot because his skin is different," she said loudly. "But my teacher says that's silly because what matters is what's in your heart and your brain." Several passengers chuckled, and Sarah's face turned red again. The girl's mother quickly ushered her back to their seats, but the child's words hung in the air. As the plane lined up on the runway, Sarah could feel her heart racing. Not because she was afraid of flying, but because she was starting to realize the magnitude of her actions. The woman who had questioned a pilot's abilities based solely on his race was now completely in his hands, trusting him with her safety while flying at 35,000 feet. The engines roared to life, and the plane began its takeoff roll. Despite her earlier concerns, Sarah noticed how smooth the takeoff was. Captain Richardson handled the aircraft with obvious skill and precision, making the climb feel almost gentle. Lisa, the flight attendant, passed by again, this time speaking quietly to the passenger across the aisle. "Captain Richardson is one of our best pilots. Last month, he safely landed a plane during a severe storm when other flights were being diverted. The passengers gave him a standing ovation that day." Sarah overheard this conversation and closed her eyes, feeling a mix of shame and embarrassment wash over her. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, she realized this flight was going to feel much longer than just 2 hours and 15 minutes. 30 minutes into the flight, the plane was cruising smoothly at 35,000 feet. Sarah Matthews was trying to work on her laptop, but she couldn't focus. The video of her behavior at the gate had now gone viral, and her phone kept buzzing with notifications even in airplane mode. A slight tremor shook the aircraft. Captain Richardson's voice came over the speakers, calm and professional as always. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some light turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts until we pass through this rough patch." Just then, an elderly man a few rows behind Sarah started having trouble breathing. His wife called out in panic, "Help! My husband. He needs his inhaler, but it's in the overhead bin." The fastened seatbelt sign was already on, and the turbulence was getting stronger. Lisa, the flight attendant, looked concerned but couldn't leave her jump seat. The plane shook again, more violently this time. To everyone's surprise, the black woman sitting next to Sarah immediately stood up, despite the turbulence. "I'm Dr. Angela Williams, a medical professional," she announced, steadying herself against the seats as she made her way to the elderly couple. The turbulence increased, making it difficult for Dr. Williams to stay on her feet. Without thinking, Sarah reached out and grabbed Dr. Williams's hand, helping her maintain balance. Together, they helped the elderly man get his inhaler and administered it to him. As the old man's breathing improved, Captain Richardson's skilled handling of the plane guided them out of the turbulent air into smoother skies. His voice came over the intercom again. "We've passed through the worst of it, folks. You may now move about the cabin, though I recommend keeping your seatbelts fastened when seated." Dr. Williams returned to her seat, and Sarah found herself speaking before she could stop herself. "That was brave of you, getting up during the turbulence to help." "It's my job," Dr. Williams replied calmly. "Just like it's Captain Richardson's job to fly this plane safely. We're both professionals who worked hard to earn our positions. The only difference is, no one questioned my abilities when they needed help." Sarah fell silent, the truth of those words hitting her hard. Behind them, passengers were talking about how smoothly Captain Richardson had handled the turbulence. Someone mentioned that many pilots would have made the ride much bumpier. Lisa came by with the drink service, and Sarah overheard her telling another passenger more about Captain Richardson. "He actually saved an entire flight last year," Lisa said. "Engine failure during a snowstorm. He landed the plane so smoothly that some passengers didn't even realize how serious it was until afterward. He received a special commendation from the airline." The elderly man who had needed the inhaler was now feeling better. He spoke loud enough for several rows to hear. "You know, back in my day, I was one of the first white teachers to work at an all-black school in Georgia. The amount of prejudice I saw, it broke my heart. But seeing a black man command this plane today and handle it so expertly shows how far we've come. Though some people," he glanced meaningfully in Sarah's direction, "still have a ways to go." Sarah's face burned with shame. She opened her laptop again, but instead of her work documents, she found herself typing a message. "Dear Captain Richardson, I need to apologize." She stopped typing when she noticed a news article on her desktop. It was about Captain Richardson, dated from the previous year. The headline read, "Hero pilot saves 220 lives in dramatic emergency landing." The article included a photo of him receiving an award for outstanding service and courage. Sarah's hands began to shake as she read about his background. Graduated with honors from the Air Force Academy, decorated military service, over a decade of commercial flying experience, and a perfect safety record. He had even started a program to mentor young pilots from underprivileged backgrounds. The realization of her prejudice and its absurdity hit her full force. Here she was, flying safely through difficult conditions, thanks to the very man whose abilities she had questioned based solely on his race. Dr. Williams noticed Sarah reading the article and said quietly, "Sometimes life has a way of teaching us the lessons we need to learn. The question is, what will you do with this learning experience?" The flight was entering its final hour, and Sarah Matthews couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. She kept glancing at the article about Captain Richardson on her laptop screen, feeling more embarrassed with each passing minute. The plane continued to fly smoothly through the clear blue sky. Lisa, the flight attendant, was now collecting trash from passengers. When she reached Sarah's row, she hesitated for a moment before saying, "You know, Captain Richardson's daughter is studying to be a pilot too. She's only 16, but she's already taking flying lessons. He often says he hopes she won't face the same prejudices he did when he started his career." Sarah's throat felt tight. She thought about her own daughter back home, who always said she wanted to be a doctor. What if someone told her she couldn't do it because of how she looked? The thought made her stomach turn. Just then, Captain Richardson's voice came over the speakers again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our initial descent into Chicago O'Hare International Airport. The local weather is partly cloudy with some light crosswinds. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing." A teenage boy sitting across the aisle was watching the viral video of Sarah's earlier behavior at the gate. He had his phone volume turned up just enough for her to hear her own voice questioning Captain Richardson's qualifications. Several other passengers glanced in her direction, some shaking their heads. Dr. Williams, who had been quiet for a while, spoke up again. "You know what's interesting? When I first started as a surgeon, many patients reacted just like you did at the gate. Some even requested different doctors. But then they'd see me in emergency situations, saving lives, and suddenly their prejudices didn't matter anymore." Sarah turned to face her. How did you deal with it?" she asked quietly. "The same way Captain Richardson dealt with you today, with professionalism and dignity," Dr. Williams replied. "Sometimes the best way to fight prejudice is to simply excel at what you do. The plane began its descent, and Sarah could see Chicago's skyline through the window. The wind had picked up, making the approach slightly bumpy. But Captain Richardson's handling of the aircraft remained steady and confident. An older businessman a few rows ahead was talking to his seatmate. "I've flown this route hundreds of times," he said. "This is one of the smoothest approaches I've experienced, especially considering the crosswinds." Sarah noticed how everyone seemed to trust Captain Richardson completely, despite the turbulence they'd encountered earlier and the current windy conditions. She thought about how she questioned his abilities without knowing anything about his impressive background or experience. The plane banked gently to line up with the runway. Through the window, Sarah could see other planes landing, some bouncing slightly in the wind. She found herself holding her breath, not from fear of Captain Richardson's abilities anymore, but from the weight of her own guilt. Lisa walked past again, reminding everyone to put their seats upright. She paused briefly near Sarah. "Captain Richardson always says that the sky doesn't care what color you are or where you come from. Up here, the only things that matter are skill, knowledge, and dedication." As they descended through the clouds, Sarah started writing again on her laptop. "Dear Captain Richardson, I owe you more than just an apology. Today, you taught me a valuable lesson about prejudice and professionalism. While I judged you without knowing anything about you, you responded with nothing but excellence and dignity." The plane touched down so smoothly that many passengers seemed surprised they were already on the ground. Several people broke into spontaneous applause. Sarah found herself clapping too, tears forming in her eyes. Dr. Williams noticed Sarah's emotional state and said softly, "You know, recognition of our mistakes is the first step toward change. What matters now is what you do next." As the plane taxied to the gate, Sarah finished typing her letter. She knew a simple apology wouldn't be enough. She needed to take real action to address her prejudices and their impact on others. The incident had gone viral, but maybe she could turn this humbling experience into an opportunity for positive change. Captain Richardson's final announcement came over the speakers. "Welcome to Chicago O'Hare. Local time is 10:45 a.m. Thank you for flying with us today." As passengers began to leave the plane, Sarah Matthews remained in her seat, still working on her letter to Captain Richardson. The viral video of her behavior had now reached over 1 million views, and her phone was flooded with messages from colleagues, friends, and even her daughter's school principal. "Ladies and gentlemen, please make sure you collect all your personal belongings before leaving the aircraft," Lisa announced over the intercom. Sarah noticed how most passengers were stopping by the cockpit to thank Captain Richardson personally. Dr. Williams stood up to get her bag from the overhead compartment. Before leaving, she handed Sarah her business card. "When you're ready to make real changes, my hospital runs diversity training programs for corporate leaders. Sometimes the most powerful advocates are those who've learned from their mistakes." Sarah took the card with trembling hands. She watched as the elderly man who had needed his inhaler during the flight walked past. He stopped at her row, leaning on his cane. "You know," he said kindly, "back when I started teaching at that all-black school, I had my own prejudices too. But admitting them and changing them made me a better person. It's never too late to learn." Finally, Sarah gathered her courage and her belongings. She was one of the last passengers to leave the plane. As she approached the cockpit, she saw Captain Richardson checking some final paperwork. He looked up as she stopped at the door, his expression professional and composed. "Captain Richardson," Sarah began, her voice shaking slightly. I need to apologize for my behavior at the gate. I was wrong, completely wrong." The captain put down his papers and turned to face her fully. "Ms. Matthews, in my 20 years of flying, I've encountered many people who doubted my abilities because of my race. Each time, I had two choices: let their prejudice define me, or let my work speak for itself." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. "The way you handled everything, the turbulence, my horrible behavior, the landing, it was all so professional. I read about how you saved that flight last year during the snowstorm." Captain Richardson smiled slightly. "That snowstorm taught me something important. When emergencies happen at 35,000 feet, nobody cares about the pilot's race. They just want someone who can do the job well." Lisa, who was standing nearby, added, "Captain Richardson doesn't just fly planes. He mentors young pilots from underprivileged backgrounds. Last year, He helped 5 students get their pilot's licenses. Sarah wiped her eyes. I run a marketing firm in Chicago, she said. Would your mentorship program be interested in free marketing services? It's the least I can do to start making amends. For the first time, Captain Richardson's professional demeanor softened slightly. That's generous of you, Ms. Matthews. But more important than any donation is what you've learned today. Will you think differently the next time you see a black professional in any field? Sarah nodded earnestly. I've already learned so much. Dr. Williams, the surgeon who sat next to me, helped me understand how people like me create unnecessary barriers for others. Just then, Sarah's phone buzzed again. The video had now been shared by several major news outlets. Comments were pouring in, most of them criticizing her actions. But instead of feeling defensive, she felt determined to use this as an opportunity for change. Captain Richardson, she said, would you be willing to let me share the whole story? Not just my terrible behavior at the gate, but also how your professionalism and skill showed me how wrong I was. Maybe it could help others confront their own prejudices. The captain considered this for a moment. If sharing this story helps prevent even one person from facing discrimination, then some good will have come from it. As Sarah finally turned to leave the plane, Captain Richardson spoke again. Ms. Matthews, my daughter dreams of becoming a commercial pilot. She's already facing doubts and prejudices at 16. What would you tell her now, after today's flight? Sarah paused at the door, thinking about her own daughter. I would tell her that skill, dedication, and professionalism speak louder than any prejudice, and I would thank her father for showing me that truth today. As she walked up the jet bridge, Sarah began drafting a social media post on her phone. It would start with, "Today, I was wrong, and a remarkable pilot showed me exactly how wrong I was." The next morning, Sarah Matthews sat in her Chicago office, staring at her computer screen. Her social media post about the incident had gone viral overnight, but in a different way than the original video. Her honest admission of prejudice and her description of Captain Richardson's professionalism had struck a chord with thousands of people. Local news stations had picked up the story. The headline on Channel 5 News read, "Viral video shows passenger's prejudice. Pilot's professionalism leads to unexpected learning moment." Sarah's phone hadn't stopped ringing since she landed. Her daughter, Emily, called from school during lunch break. "Mom, my friends showed me the videos," Emily said, her voice serious. "The first one made me cry. I was so embarrassed. But your post about learning from it, that made me proud. My teacher even discussed it in our social studies class today." As Sarah tried to focus on her work, her office assistant knocked on the door. "Ms. Matthews, you might want to see this," she said, turning on the office TV. Captain Richardson was being interviewed live on a morning news show. "Yes, it was an unfortunate situation at first," Captain Richardson was saying on TV, his voice as calm as it had been during the flight. "But what's important is what happened afterward." Ms. Matthews showed that people can learn and change when they confront their own prejudices. The interviewer leaned forward. "Captain Richardson, we've learned that you've been flying for over 20 years. You're a decorated Air Force veteran, and you run a mentorship program for minority youth interested in aviation. How did you maintain such professionalism in the face of discrimination?" Captain Richardson smiled. "When you're responsible for hundreds of lives at 35,000 feet, you can't let anything distract you from doing your job safely. Besides, the best response to prejudice is excellence." Sarah's office phone rang. It was Dr. Angela Williams, the surgeon who had sat next to her on the flight. "I saw your social media post," Dr. Williams said. "Our hospital's diversity training program starts next month. Would you be interested in sharing your story as a case study?" Before Sarah could answer, her assistant rushed back in. "The Chicago Tribune wants to interview you, and there's a national morning show online too. They want both you and Captain Richardson for a segment about learning from mistakes and overcoming prejudice." Sarah's company's board of directors sent an urgent email. They had seen the viral videos and her public apology. Instead of the reprimand she expected, they were asking her to lead a new initiative on diversity and inclusion in the workplace. Looking out her office window at the Chicago skyline, Sarah thought about how differently this could have ended. If Captain Richardson had responded to her prejudice with anger, if he hadn't shown such remarkable professionalism, if Dr. Williams hadn't taken the time to help her understand. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Ms. Matthews, this is Captain Richardson's daughter, Maya. Dad shared your apology with me. I'm 16 and starting flight school next month. Some people tell me girls, especially black girls, can't be pilots. Your story helps me stay strong. Thank you for admitting you were wrong and trying to change." Sarah wiped tears from her eyes as she read the message. She thought about Maya, about her own daughter Emily, about all the people who face discrimination every day. Her assistant knocked again, this time with news that a major airline wanted her to work with Captain Richardson on their corporate sensitivity training program. The office TV was still on, and now they were interviewing some of the passengers from yesterday's flight. The elderly man with the inhaler was speaking. It was amazing to watch. "We saw prejudice transform into understanding in real time, all because a pilot chose to respond to discrimination with dignity and excellence." Sarah opened her laptop and started typing a new post. "Yesterday, I was the woman who went viral for questioning a pilot's abilities because of his race. Today, I'm someone learning that change is possible when we confront our prejudices. Captain Richardson didn't just fly a plane yesterday, he taught me, and now thousands of others, an invaluable lesson about judgment, professionalism, and the importance of looking beyond our biases." Her assistant appeared one more time. "Ms. Matthews, Captain Richardson's mentorship program is holding an event next week. They'd like you to be a speaker. The topic is how confronting our biases changes lives." Sarah looked at Maya's text message again and smiled. "Tell them yes," she said. "It's time to turn this mistake into something meaningful." 1 year later, Sarah Matthews stood at a podium in Atlanta International Airport's main conference room. The room was packed with pilots, airline staff, corporate leaders, and students. This was the first anniversary of what had become known as the flight that changed minds. Captain James Richardson sat in the front row, wearing his pilot's uniform, next to his daughter Maya, now 17 and already halfway through her pilot training. Dr. Angela Williams was there too, having become a regular speaker at diversity programs across the country. "A year ago, right here in this airport," Sarah began, her voice clear and confident, "I was the woman who went viral for all the wrong reasons. I questioned a pilot's abilities based solely on his race. That pilot was Captain Richardson." The audience was silent, many filming her speech on their phones. Among them were several passengers from that famous flight, including the elderly man with the inhaler and his wife. "But today, we're celebrating something different," Sarah continued. "In the past year, Captain Richardson's mentorship program has helped 30 young people get their pilot's licenses. Half of them are young women of color. My marketing firm has provided free services, helping spread the word to communities that never thought aviation was for them." She gestured to a large screen behind her, which showed pictures of the program's success stories. Among them was a photo of Maya Richardson in her training uniform, standing proudly next to her father's commercial airliner. "The video of my prejudice that day has been viewed over 10 million times," Sarah said. "But my post about learning from that mistake has been viewed even more. We've received thousands of messages from people sharing their own stories of confronting and overcoming their biases." Captain Richardson stood up and joined Sarah at the podium. "What happened that day could have ended with just another viral video about discrimination," he said. "Instead, it became a teaching moment that reached millions. Sometimes our worst moments can lead to our best changes." Lisa, the flight attendant from that day, now a flight crew supervisor, stepped forward with an announcement. "Our airline is proud to introduce the Richardson Scholarship. Every year, 10 students from underprivileged backgrounds will receive full funding for flight school." The crowd erupted in applause. Maya wiped tears from her eyes as her father hugged her. Dr. Williams stood up and added her own news. "And the hospital where I work has started a similar program for minority medical students. Change spreads change." Sarah revealed the final surprise. Captain Richardson's mentorship program is now expanding to 10 more cities. "My company has pledged full marketing support for the next 5 years, and 5 major corporations have joined as sponsors." The elderly man who had needed his inhaler on the flight raised his hand to speak. "I've been alive long enough to see both the worst and best of people," he said. "This story shows that it's never too late to learn and change." As the ceremony ended, a group of young flight school students gathered around Captain Richardson for photos. Among them was Sarah's daughter Emily, who had been inspired to start flying lessons herself. "You know what the best part is?" Maya said to Sarah privately. "Every time someone shares your story, another person learns to question their prejudices. It's like a chain reaction of change." Sarah's phone buzzed with a notification. Another major news network wanted to do an anniversary story about that famous flight, but this time they were focusing on the positive changes it had sparked across the country. Captain Richardson had one more flight to make that day. As he walked through the terminal in his uniform, people stopped to shake his hand. Some recognized him from the viral video, others from his work with young pilots. But most importantly, no one questioned his right to be in the cockpit. Sarah watched him walk toward his gate, remembering how differently she had viewed him a year ago. Her phone buzzed again. It was a message from a woman in Texas. "I just caught myself judging someone unfairly at work. Then I remembered your story and stopped myself. Thank you for showing us that we can all learn and grow." As the afternoon sun streamed through the airport's large windows, Sarah looked at all the pilots walking through the terminal, men and women of all races. She thought about how one flight, one mistake, and one choice to learn from it had created ripples of change that were still spreading. Maya's voice rang out across the terminal. "Dad, wait up. I want to watch your pre-flight check." She ran after her father, her pilot trainee badge gleaming, living proof that excellence knows no color.